Welcome to Just Theory. In this episode, we speak with Raquel Barradas de Freitas, who currently works as a law clerk to the president of the Portuguese Constitutional Court and as lecturer in jurisprudence at Trinity College, Oxford. Raquel's primary research interests are in general jurisprudence, with a focus on interpretation, practical and theoretical reasoning, judicial decision-making, and, in particular, the justification of judicial decisions. In this episode, we talk about the validity of tech-powered predictive analytics in constitutional courts, judicial authority, and the role of trust in modern constitutional order. So, without further ado, we now present you episode 2 on trust and judicial patterns. Welcome to our podcast. Welcome to Just Theory. We are absolutely delighted to have you, and we're going to kick off with exactly the same way that we kick off every episode. And we would be delighted to hear more about how you and why you chose the career in academia and why you decided to stay.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today. How did I get into academia? I can't really recall when I made the decision. I just know that the decision wasn't strategic. I realized, I think, quite early in my undergraduate law studies that there were things that I wanted to study more deeply than I could do in the context of a law degree. And I wanted to take them in different directions, in directions that I wasn't able to take them if I continued, as normally sort of a typical law student might if I went into law practice. I enjoyed most of the core legal subjects, of course, but the ones I enjoyed the most were the non-legal, more theoretical subjects, like jurisprudence, which was a compulsory subject in my second year, legal anthropology, the history of ideas, the history of law. Those are the subjects I really enjoyed. And also eventually it became quite clear that I really wanted to study interpretation. And I think that's, coming to the end of my undergraduate degree, I think that's how I started. That's how I decided to continue into a postgraduate, in a postgraduate direction, to do a master's and a doctorate. Why have I stayed? I think for 3 reasons. The first reason, I think, is that I've had really wonderful students along the way. And that has made such a difference. I actually discovered along the way that I very, very much enjoyed teaching. I didn't expect that. I never thought of being a teacher. I just wanted to study. And then I realized that I really enjoyed teaching. So that's the first reason, the wonderful students I've had. They've made me want to continue. The second reason is the intellectual freedom that I think we still have, quite uniquely in academia. And finally, I think there was also the thought that there is a lot of work that I would still like to do, ideas that I want to explore, questions I want to ask. And I think academic life is the right context in which to do that, or the most conducive to that. So I think those are the 3 reasons why I've stayed. And of course, the most appealing, I think, feature of general jurisprudence, which is what I've been doing, is that, of course, in the analytic tradition, is that it is a subject of more questions than answers. I think I'm really attracted to that. I think it's very good to be in the business of asking questions.
May I just intersect at this point briefly? You've mentioned, and it's very clear that your scholarship is grounded in this analytical tradition. So I wonder, where did that concrete interest in analytic philosophy, or obviously there are elements of philosophy of language and everyday ordinary language philosophy as well. So I just wondered why particular interest in analytical philosophy?
Well, it happened by chance in a way. I did a little bit of research when I was applying for scholarship and realized, of course, even before that, having read a little bit of Hart and Dworkin and Raz when I studied jurisprudence, that Oxford was perhaps the place for jurisprudence. And I ended up going to Oxford for my doctorate, and I was lucky enough to have a wonderful supervisor. And I think by osmosis, by immersion, I really, I became an analytic philosopher. It was a steep learning curve because I had come from a very different philosophical tradition. A lot of French philosophers and German philosophers here in Portugal, they're very popular and very influential. But when I arrived at Oxford, all of that was sort of set aside for a period, encouraged by my supervisor, who told me to forget about the French for a while. And that's how it happened. And then it became my way of doing things. It's really a method, analytic philosophy. It's a philosophical method more than anything else.
It's beautiful because there is always somebody, I mean, it really resonated with me because the way I fell into analytic philosophy was exactly the same trajectory. At some point, one of my mentors, gave me a book and said, read about logic. That is far more valuable than Camus. And that was it.
Emilia.
I suppose this is why I admire actually Wittgenstein, because he bridges the gap between this continental tradition and analytic or analytical tradition. I always use this term interchangeably. But it appears to me that there is incredible appeal in analytic philosophy, ambition for certainty and clarity, which falls apart in some continental thought. Yes. At the same time, and this is something that I wish to perhaps return to later on in our interview, when we look about the virtue of truth and the virtue of trust as such, or trust more importantly, importantly, I think it exhibits an important ontological dimension that pure linguistic analysis cannot always capture. So if we can come back to this perhaps at a later stage, because I think what was also very interesting in what you told us about your path and your trajectory is the experience that you now have advising for the court. So if you could tell us perhaps about that practical aspect of your work, that would be fantastic.
Yes, of course. So this was a kind of challenge that I was given about a year and a half ago by the current president of the Portuguese Constitutional Court, who was actually my administrative law professor when I was an undergraduate here. So he said, it was a very open brief. He said, I've always wanted to learn more about the decision-making process of the justices, how they reach the decisions that they reach, the reasons, both motivating and normative, that that count towards a particular decision. What can you do? And it was a very daunting challenge, because there was so much we could do. There were also limitations, because I am not an empirical scholar, and I haven't done empirical work. But it seemed to me that interesting things could be done in an interdisciplinary way. So that's what I've been doing. The study has just been completed and will be launched next week. We were lucky to get 2 researchers on board, one political scientist and a physicist who specializes, in fact, in natural language processing. And we analyzed the case law of the court and did a study about more specifically about the deliberative character of the court, and about collegiality in the court, how it manifests itself in this court in particular, but also with some general considerations about collegiality as a virtue, in fact. So that's what I've been doing, and along the way I interviewed quite a few justices, current and previous. And of course, I sneaked in some philosophical questions about, what they thought about the limits of interpretation, the substance and limits of the judicial role. But of course, the most challenging part was to read the case law of the court and to try to extract from it information about patterns of decision making. And we made some really interesting findings. Of course, it was nerve-wracking at points because we didn't know what we were going to find, especially in terms of political polarization, political ideology. But it's been really interesting and enriching. So I think we found a way to produce a cross-disciplinary study which offers both a theoretical analysis of the court. It's just celebrating its 40th anniversary, so it's a good occasion to reflect. And also about more generally about the limits of the judicial role in apex courts.
That's fascinating.
Yes, so it's a bit of a mix of empirical work with more theoretical philosophical work.
That's fascinating, and that's fascinating for two reasons. Of course, I always felt like the empirical tradition has been grounded more in the US. So there's a long tradition of empirical studies of the Scotus, and it has been for a long time. And I always felt like there was this divide very much in US academia between those doing the empirical research on a Scotus as opposed to those doing the strictly theoretical analysis. Yeah. So seeing that merged in Europe is just fantastic, and I can't wait to tell everybody about it. But I would also say that what's also interesting about this is that France recently banned predictive analytics of the courts. And I believe that the trend in which the use of AI technology to analyze publicly available judgments, the way it's going is, I would say, against what you're doing. And I think there are real efforts to block any initiatives that would look into judgments. And, of course, it's not just about the fact that prediction is only as good as, or prediction based on past patterns is only as good as, the first example of this not being true. But it's also about this, I don't know, there's something really disconcerting about this idea that this similar studies can be banned in the future just on the basis of, I don't really know on which basis the France banned it. I mean, I presume that it's, trying not to limit the use of AI or, spotting patterns, or maybe there's something on the grounds of undermining legitimacy of the court.
Yes, I suppose that's probably the grounds on which they made the decision. But, I think there is a difference between looking for patterns in decision making, in order to understand it better and to understand, what goes into the decision making process. On the one hand, patterns which we wouldn't be able to detect with the naked eye, just by reading, even close reading of the decisions. It's just not the same. We're not able to do that yet, human beings. And there's a difference between doing that and then using that to make predictions about what courts will do in future cases. I'm not a big fan of the idea of prediction myself. I don't think it's very helpful to try to. It could be interesting to try to predict, but we wouldn't go very far, I think, in understanding the nature of the judicial process, and the role of course of normative reasons in decision making.
We sign up to the completely same school, by the way, but it's the same with, I have the same problem with econometrics, but that's a different conversation. But what would be very interesting is that it seems like you're developing almost a case study. Your work is almost a case study in itself that people could really learn from in terms of that interdisciplinary collaboration and how technology and how working with different fields and between the collaboration between pragmatists and theoreticians can help. But Emilia, I know you're dying to ask a question, so
well, I'm always this is why scripted conversations or scripted interviews never work, because every response bring so many new questions on new dimensions. I just wanted to add that what you were discussing right now is the idea that we could ignore a progress in technology or progress in artificial intelligence, or how attempts at devising such patterns for decision making would be unrealistic. We must acknowledge the fact that there is now certain technology in place, or technologies in place, that can help us put some, I wouldn't say predictable algorithms, but there are such attempts that are being made everywhere. So to simply ignore them is irresponsible in my view, especially in such an important area as judicial decision making. Another aspect that emerged or occurred to me, maybe I'm wrong, but if you're working with Constitutional Court, there will be some elements or some moments where translation becomes also relevant, especially at the EU level, when the Constitutional Court engages with the EU decisions. We had, Aleksandra is smiling because we had a speaker who has done incredible work in that field, and I was wondering if you had in your project, if you came across those moments of translation at constitutional level that could complicate matters even further.
Well, we didn't. My colleague who did the text mining work we had a very specific agenda. We were very conscious of things that we could not do, simply because we didn't have the time or the resources to do them. We didn't specifically talk about that aspect, but of course it's an important aspect. And I wonder how that could be managed. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm very conscious of the fact that, and this is something that I've been thinking about. I will need to talk a bit about the study next week when we present it. And it's really, I'm really conscious of the fact that we've opened a door, and it's only slightly open. I hope that, as Aleksandra was saying, other scholars will, in Portugal and in Europe, where this sort of work isn't frequently done yet, that other scholars will take this as an invitation to pursue this sort of question. In relation to translation, I really don't know. I would have to think more about that.
Perhaps you can tell us more about your academic work now, unless, Aleksandra, if you have any other.
Oh, I think if we continue down this way, we're probably going to end up having an entire episode about this, because I was already thinking about in my head around judicial skepticism and how we can imagine, for example, back in my home country, that there may be some resistance to adopting any kind of analytics to court judgments from the judiciary themselves. But as I said, if we get into it,
I could say one more thing about that, actually. From
please do.
Generally, it was, of course, this came from the president of the court, who's a very open-minded person with interests, in sort of new ideas and new ways of doing things. It wasn't an entirely smooth journey, because it wasn't, enthusiastically received by everyone. Some justices were reluctant to just even be interviewed, just even to talk in depth about their role and their job at the court. There was there was some suspicion about this empirical kind of work, focusing on the court, about trying to bring out into the open or into the public domain things about the decisions of the court that a layperson or even a more specialized lawyer cannot extract by reading a judgment. That idea alone clearly generated some discomfort, or at least some caution, which of course are completely understandable. And you know, so it's not an entirely easy kind of project to pursue at the moment, and in particular in this domain, in judicial decision making. Not because judges are reluctant to reveal how they make decisions, but because I think in many cases, judges are aware of the fact that they are themselves not entirely knowledgeable about what conditions their decisions. And I think that awareness, which is a very responsible awareness, makes them feel cautious about exploring this kind of topic.
And it's a perfect segue into the topic of trust, which I think was what Emilia was getting at when she asked me that question.
And the topic of truth, I suppose. So we were absolutely privileged to get access to your work on the matter of trust at the edited collection, and also your article on 3 variations on law and truth. So could you tell us more about those projects, about the edited collection first, and then perhaps about your article on the variations on law and truth?
A bit of an experimental article, actually. Well, the volume was a project that took us 3 years to complete. It was a journey. It started out as a workshop at the European University Institute in Florence when I was there as a postgrad a few years ago. I just realized that there were other people working on trust in different disciplines, and you know, that is the perfect setting. In fact, the Max Weber program, I think, is the perfect setting for talking to people to whom you would not, normally talk, because they work in completely different disciplines. It's really a privilege to be able to do that. So there were historians, sociologists, political scientists, economists who were interested in trust. And I was interested in trust as a philosopher. So right at the start, I realized, we need to talk to each other about trust in a robust way, because we could all learn so much more from each other instead of staying in our respective methodological bubbles. So when we had a chance to organize a workshop, we got together a few of us, 4 of us, in fact, and we organized a workshop and invited people from different disciplines, including a cognitive scientist and a historian who joined us for the workshop. The workshop went really well. It was really really productive. And so on the basis of that workshop, we decided to go ahead and send a proposal to Hart with, for an edited collection. And for that collection, we commissioned a few more chapters. And that's how it came together, Trust Matters. It's a collection of essays on trust and the role of trust in public life and in social life, in the life of the law, across the spectrum. And it's been an extremely enriching project. Hard work, but very, very enriching.
In your introduction, you say that in an age of post-trust, can we cut this?
As I said, take 5 seconds and start over. We both know that the instructions I give to our guests are mostly instructions I give to us, so.
In your introduction, you say, in an age of post-truth, alternative facts, populism, manipulation, disenchantment, and uncertainty, it becomes urgent to shed light on the logic and value of trust. I was wondering how important it is for an average person to engage with the question of trust, as opposed to just academic analysis, or perhaps what's the role of academic analysis in expanding and illuminating the notion of trust for an average person who is subject to this disenchantment with trust.
I think thinking in particular about philosophical analysis of the concept of trust, I think that's exactly what it does. It breaks concepts down into its simplest components, and encourages us to look at each one of those components without, well, as far as possible, without preconceived ideas, and to question our understanding of these components and of the concept in our daily lives. And of course, if it's productive, if it's done well, it clarifies things for us. And it, in some cases, as Wittgenstein would say, it just simply, it's simply the work dissolves problems, merely apparent problems that we thought existed, but actually don't exist. So, for example, we might think there is a crisis of trust, when in fact what we're facing is, confusion about legitimate authority, what makes someone's authority legitimate or morally justifiable. And so it can be helpful in that way. It can introduce distinctions that can help us to see more clearly through the jungle of concepts, not just because we sometimes use terms at the same term to refer to different concepts, but also because we sometimes muddle concepts, and more clarity is always an advantage.
My immediate impression was that your work offers this cooling effect on area which is very much emotionally loaded already. The notion of trust is or exhibits emotive dimension that carries this emotional pull for wider audiences. So I thought, oh, this is a wonderful book that people who are so fiercely engaged in politics on their everyday basis, in their armchairs, perhaps could read this book as a kind of cooling effect, or to offer them more balanced understanding of what is actually going on when we speak of trust in politics.
This is amazing, Emilia, because your impression is super complimentary to mine. I thought, at risk of sounding like a massive fangirl, because interdisciplinarity is very close to my heart. Even to structure, it's one way to focus on a content. And I think in a content of the book, you state your mission very, very clearly. And I think when you justify how you structure the book, you talk about, learning about law and its limits by learning more about the logic and justification of power and authority, so connecting those two together, and then thinking in the other direction about learning about power and authority, but learning more about the attitude of trust. But then also talking about how we can learn much about trust by talking to scholars working in other disciplines. And all that is tied up with a very nice, neat ribbon of writing, of the entire collection being written in such an accessible manner that you almost knock out any negative attitudes that the reader may hold from the outset, which I think really we can all learn from. And a lot of scholars working in highly controversial fields or highly emotively charged, as Emilia suggested, can really learn from, because there is this. And maybe on a topic of trust and authority, I think there is throughout the COVID pandemic, there was the relationship between experts and expert authority and public trust and expert authority got somewhat tarnished and somewhat undermined. And I think your book is a really good case study on how to approach this subject or how to approach topics like this and how to rebuild this trust, while also talking about it in a very, obviously academic and very expert way. But it doesn't, I don't know what it is, Emilia, but I don't know if you can point your finger at what it is when you read it that you don't feel attacked, or you really, Raquel, you really drag the reader in on a journey.
But that's not entirely true, because I actually also felt conflicted. So I felt this calming effect reading your work, but also there was this element of my continental protest coming from.
Oh, I don't have a continental. That's why I felt this way. Because
so I felt like, okay, we reduce the matter or the virtue of trust to somewhat linguistic and pragmatic level, but this ontological ethical dimension that cannot always be captured was kind of calling from within. So I had this conflict between, okay, can we really reduce trust to simple definitions and propositions, or we need to leave some space that remains undefined or remains indeterminate. So yeah, I don't know. So I feel calmed down, but also conflicted by reading the work.
I'm really, thank you for your really generous comments about the book. I'm really glad that you found, that you found it clear and that you found the contributions, thought-provoking in a calming way. I think that the affective dimension of trust is, I think, one of the things I learned along the way, and of course there are very different views on trust in the literature, in the philosophical literature in particular, about what trust means in the thick sense. I think that it undoubtedly has an affective dimension, and one of the ways in which we see that at play is in the fact that when someone's trust is broken or breached, whatever term you might want to use, the person is betrayed. They're not, so the appropriate emotion, moral emotion, is the emotion of perhaps indignation. The betrayal, not disappointment, is what happens when you break someone's trust, when you violate their trust. And I think that's very clear. That's a point that Annette Bayer raises in her work, and I think that's very, that opens the door to thinking about trust not just as an affective attitude, but as an affective attitude, at least partly. It's inescapably affective, and also there's also an interesting thing about trust, which is that it is curiously quite resistant to evidence of untrustworthiness. So I think that's another sign of its affective dimension. Even in the face of evidence of someone's untrustworthiness, in sometimes systematically, trust remains. So the affective element of trust is, I think, quite strongly present, and we can't ignore it. And I think that, of course, that as a consequence of that, inquiries about trust will always have to have a contextual dimension. But still, there are a few things we can say in the abstract about trust, which can help us understand it better and distinguish it from other things. But I don't think we can escape the contextual elements of what makes a trusting relationship, for example. It is a relationship, at least under some understanding of trust. So yes, affective and contextual, definitely.
I wonder what is helpful at this point when we feel betrayed is to ask ourselves, was it really trust that was being broken, or perhaps something else, especially in political context, when we think about legitimacy of political decision making or our authorities? Where do they derive this authority from? Is it really this personal trust that I invest a political leader with, or perhaps a judge, not necessarily a political leader, but some sort of authority who had this trust delegated? Is it really that I'm delegating trust, or I'm delegating something else? You've mentioned in your now I'm skipping to the article on 3 variations on law and truth. At some point you engage with Wittgenstein and his concept of certainty. You indicate that the only certainty I can have is my own, or whatever certainty I have is my own certainty. I think what Wittgenstein is trying to emphasize in this phrase is that the only possibility for collective certainty is merely agreement in judgment, so to say, social contract, as if whereby we simply agree on the best possible course of action without necessarily entrusting it with such high level of trust as we would entrust someone close to us or ourselves. It almost of Wittgenstein definition almost obliterates the possibility of collective certainty or collective trust. I was wondering what's your thoughts on trust in political life, or a possibility of high level trust in political sphere or the sphere of authority, if it makes any sense what I just try to say.
Yes, so when I chose that little quote from Wittgenstein's on certainty because I think it brought out, of course I'm sure Wittgenstein meant much more sophisticated things than I suggest he means when he says that my certainty is my own, or that certainty is my own. I use that quote in the context of this little piece, just to say that, and of course the piece was trying to reflect about legal certainty, the value of legal certainty, and against the background of the ideal of the rule of law, or the virtue of the rule of law, if you want to talk about virtues. And I was just trying to suggest that sometimes there is an excessive focus on certainty, when certainty really is a mental state, it's as Wittgenstein would put it, my own. When in fact, perhaps what we should be focusing on is on predictability and stability, and all those features that we associate with the ideal of the rule of law. When it comes to trust, so certainty is, it's volatile. It's a volatile concept, inherently volatile. It's a mental state, it's a psychological state. I may or may not be certain of something. My certainty gives me, or rather, well, not me, but gives others no assurance of the truth of that of which I'm certain, or of any statement I might be able to make on the basis of that certainty. So, I can be certain but wrong, but mistaken. And so I don't think we should rely so much, or as much as some do, on the concept of certainty, when in fact what we want to talk about are conditions for stable social life, and for a wholesome, if you like, social coordination and life in society, cohabitation in a diverse, complex society, and the role that law can or should play in achieving those ends. And so going back to trust, again, I haven't worked out these ideas fully yet. I'm still thinking about this. I'm hoping to write a bit more about it, because I've only so far written an introduction to a volume of collected essays. So I haven't really developed these ideas properly. But I think that we often confuse trust with, or we often confuse things like reliability, stability, and even authority with trust. And we charge them with meanings that they don't necessarily have. And I don't think that's necessarily beneficial. I'm thinking about sort of the idea of overstretched concepts that some people talk about, even in relation to the rule of law. I think that's something to be wary of. Don't stretch concepts too far. Don't turn them into broad umbrellas under which all these different sorts of things can fit. I mean, it can be comforting in ordinary conversation, but But I think philosophical, work is there to help us see through that and avoid that, and to sharpen concepts so that we can use them more productively in the right contexts. And I think trust is one of those concepts. I think it's very easily confused with authority. So reasons of trust. Earlier, Emilia, you were saying trust in experts or trust in authority. Why do we talk about trust at all when we're talking about the recognition of authority or the acceptance of authoritative directives? Those are different things, and so we need to clarify. I think we benefit from clarifying.
This is why perhaps it's not always justified when we feel so betrayed in the circumstances where there was nothing that one should feel being betrayed by in those institutional contexts, perhaps.
So there were failings, but not necessarily failings of betrayal. Of trust.
I feel I managed to get ahead of myself again by trying to mix the matter of trust with the questions of certainty or legal certainty that you ask in your second
it's a wonderful question.
But I feel there is some element of intersection between the two, and in particular this dimension of trust that has never or remains underexplored in the legal context and in the political sphere perhaps as well. So I found it fascinating to try to read both entries, so to say, together and try to find the points of intersection between your work.
Is part of it also, because the more we talk about it, the more apparent to me becomes the distinction between the emotional aspect or how the emotional layer, so to speak, of our societal interactions, of us, our human nature, interacts with fundamental questions of authority, which are fundamentally devoid of emotion. So the political sphere is so emotionally charged, but I don't think the legal and the structure of our institutions is so emotionally charged to the same extent. And actually, when reading your paper, if Emilia is so keen to move on to it, when reading your paper, when you speak about judges, the one question that I couldn't shake off is that of the institutional consequences of a breach of trust. If we say, we trust a judge as a human, how does that translate into the institutional considerations or the institutional framework where the judges sit in? Because fundamentally, I don't know, I'm beginning to believe that it's very difficult to undermine the authority of an institution, even if it can be very easy to undermine trust between us and a member of a profession or a representative of a government who sits within that structure. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on how do we reconcile the two?
Well, I think in particular in relation to the judicial role, people they seem to associate judges with, this, with ideas such as, reliability, trustworthiness, expertise. And so that's the kind of the ordinary understanding of, the judicial role. And it's, it's still quite prestigious to be a judge, also for that reason, right? People sort of, if you're invested in that role, people kind of, people assume that you have these qualities, which are really fundamental human qualities, if you think about it. Apart from expertise, of course, which comes through your training and experience, etc. But there is this view of the judicial role still. I don't know, maybe not everywhere, but certainly in the societies I know. And I find that really curious because, in the end, what judges do is speak and act on behalf of the law. Right? If you'll allow the personification, they speak on behalf of the law. They make decisions. They have the authority, the de facto authority to resolve cases in a way that affects and changes the normative positions of the addressees of their decisions. So that is a fact about the familiar legal systems, right? That's their role. And there is an important type of value served by the exercise of that role. That the idea that, that finality in decision making has value. We all know about that, and it's, but I just don't think it's very helpful to bring trust into the equation when you're trying to understand the limits of a role. Although, of course, when you want to investigate the role and when you want to look, to zoom in and really try to understand if a particular judge, for example, really occupies their role in a way that then makes recognition of their authority really justified in sort of moral terms, or in terms of political morality, if you like, then you will, of course, perhaps more easily fall into the temptation of thinking about questions of trustworthiness. But I think that we have to start at a more basic level. I think we need to try to define the judicial role first. And by that, I mean to understand, normatively speaking, what norms, duties, obligations, standards in general constitute the role. Before we talk about questions of the limits of their authority as judges, and before we try to understand what makes a judge trustworthy. I think the idea that we see in some of the literature about trust, that trust is a three-place relation. A trusts B to do X, or to phi. I think that's helpful. And I think that calls our attention to the contextual and sometimes role-specific limits of trust. But the same can be said about authority, right? We need to understand the jurisdiction of authorities before we even begin to ask whether certain directives are exclusionary reasons in a particular case. And so the kinds of questions that we ask about authority and about trust are very, very similar, and that makes things more difficult. I think, having said that, I think in more general terms, I think it's desirable to trust judges in general as a, if you like, a profession, and the institutions in which they work, only if that trust is warranted. So trust is a virtue only if there are conditions for warranted trust. And so I don't think it's particularly helpful. That's why I don't think it's particularly helpful to talk about trust when we're trying to understand the judicial role. It's helpful to talk about it when we're trying to understand social attitudes to institutions, and try to understand where they come from and what explains them. But I think that's it. If we're really trying to understand the judicial role, its limits, the place of courts in constitutional dialogue and a political setting, I don't think it's particularly helpful to talk about trust. I'm not sure I answered your question, Aleksandra, sorry.
Oh, you very much did. Thank you very much. It's a very difficult area to begin with, because at least, I don't know if you share my perspective or share my perception, but it seems like there is, even though the empirical and the theoretical worlds don't mix, when we get into jurisprudence meets, political theory, everything seems to be put roughly in the same space, and it's very and there is something really strange about that dynamic, which is why I was very curious about your thoughts. So it seems like we do need to be a little bit more careful around separating what effectively is the tools that are helping us with exploring the public attitudes, but the public attitudes do not necessarily affect the question of authority or legitimacy. And so it's just it's nice to hear that out loud, and it's nice to hear that elaborated in a very clear way. So thank you.
Thank you. My ideas about this are still being formed. So
I think everybody's ideas about this are still being formed, Raquel, but you're far.
Thanks for encouraging me to think more about this. I need to think more about this.
Could we just briefly skip back to the question of truth and obviously legal certainty more broadly?
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell us what's your key thesis in your article on three variations on law and truth? What's the key argument here?
Well, so the thing about this article is that there is no one argument, and that's a bit annoying. This paper is based on a talk I gave a couple of years ago at a meeting of the Philosophical Society here in Lisbon, and what I decided to, so they gave me a theme, law and truth, do something with it. And because I was working on specific things at the time, what I decided to do was just to think about how different research agendas that I was interested in pursuing could be traced back to the axis of law and truth. And so it was more of a kind of imaginative exercise than anything else. There isn't an argumentative thread running through the article. I explored the theme of law and truth in three variations. So I used the musical metaphor to do this. And this allowed me to talk a bit about things that I either had written about, which were connected to, very broadly, to the central theme, questions about rule skepticism and rule-centric views of interpretation on the one hand, and which I called the old question. So the question of whether legal statements have truth value or are truth apt, can be true or false. I sort of gave an overview of possible lines of research in the domain of the old question. Then moved on to the second variation, in which I talk a bit about expertise and always, of course, focusing on the judicial role, which was my main focus. And I talked a little bit about testimony, because there's something I really like to do as soon as I have time, just to think a bit about and write about what judges do, partly counting as an instance of testimony, in particular when they interpret. And if it's testimony, then perhaps we could say, along the lines of some philosophers in epistemology, I'm thinking about Ted Hinchman, who's written specifically about this, who suggests that acts of telling or acts of testimony invite the trust of the hearer in what they're saying or in them. I'd like to explore that, and I'd like to explore the moral or ethical implications of that. If judges, when they produce interpretive conclusions or statements, when they're interpreting a particular legal text or the Constitution, as they do here in the Constitutional Court, that's their job. Are they inviting the addressee of their judgments to trust them? Is there an invitation to trust? If there is an invitation to trust, then that is in itself morally salient. And what are the consequences of that? So that's the other sort of research agenda that I'd like to pursue. And I talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I talk about, in variation 3, I talk about the virtue of certainty, or the virtue of the rule of law, what that means in relation to trust. do we need trust if we have the rule of law? Do we need trust in a legal system if that legal system is reasonably compliant with the requirements of the rule of law, or reasonably successful in meeting the requirements of the rule of law? So that's broadly what I do in the paper. I just introduce questions, really, basically, and
Now I feel guilty for asking that question, because you openly admit right at the beginning of the paper that what you are doing is not pursuing any concrete claims, but exploring a theme, which is like an octopus that can go in all sorts of directions. But I think there is incredible value in asking those questions, and even trying to dig into the relationship between authority and trust. For example, is there such connection to be made, or is there a connection to be made between certainty and the rule of law as such, or perhaps to sound like a complete rule skeptic, like maybe Schmidt, who would say that all law is situational, we should not have any trust in rules being capable of leading human conduct. So I found those questions and the exploration, which you actually do offer, of those questions, incredibly thought-provoking. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Emilia, I feel like, at least my perspective, and something that just occurred to me, is that we need more of these papers that pull out the questions, even if for the communities to start exploring them. Because unless we start treating legal theory, and I guess part of this podcast is that effort as well, right? And unless we start building that community that can answer those questions together, I really don't think that anybody has enough time in their lifetime to pursue a single topic and completely explore it. So maybe with that in mind, Raquel, unless you have any final thoughts on the discussion, we can probably move on to the final 5 questions for our know-how bank.
Yes.
So the first one is as follows: who or what was your biggest inspiration in your career?
Oh, these sort of desert island discs sort of questions are so difficult. So I have to say, I mean, there have been so many people at different stages, and I imagine that many people will say this, right? It's very difficult to identify one person, or but in terms of various people at in different moments of my life, teachers, friends, family members, acquaintances, colleagues, authors of books I've read, films I've seen, but in terms of academic and intellectual development, I think I would have to, if I had to identify one person, it would be John Gardner, my supervisor, who was an extraordinary person, and who really changed so much. I mean, he was the engine of change of so much in my life. I mean, he's clearly my most decisive intellectual influence. But he was also a complete person, and I learned so much from him. And one thing that stands out, apart from the obvious sort of intellectual enormity of the person, was his generosity. In every way, he was so generous, not only with me, but with all his students, with everyone around him. And he was totally, he taught me an important, among many, an important lesson, which was that I shouldn't try to constantly justify the kind of work that I'm trying to do by convincing others that it's instrumentally useful, that it's useful. that it's instrumental to some bigger aim or some more noble end. I had many doubts about this when I was writing my thesis, and he kept saying, Raquel, what you're doing is valuable in itself. Don't worry about it. You're not indulging by, spending a year, reading around the philosophy of music because you want to understand philosophy, interpretation better. If this is what you need to do in order to tackle the philosophical problems that you're facing, then that's what you're going to do. And you shouldn't feel bad about it. So I was constantly worried that I was on a scholarship. I need to use my time extremely wisely. Am I indulging in these intellectual pursuits? And he showed me that it's very important to recognize the value of philosophical work without instrumentalizing it. And that was a big lesson. I learned so much from him. I'm still learning so much from him. His written work is more and more influential on me. So I'm so grateful to him, and I'm just very sorry that he's no longer here, because there are many conversations that I'd like to have with him that I can't. But there are many other people that I could talk about. I don't know if you want me to, or whether that was what you had in mind.
That's going to be a hard act to follow, I have to say. I think the community generally is very sorry about that huge loss to philosophy globally. But with that in mind, talking about your supervisor, that really segues us into our next question, which is, what do you wish you could tell your graduate student self?
Oh. Well, there were quite a few things. I think the first thing would be, don't be afraid of making mistakes, and don't be afraid of taking intellectual risks. Don't be overly cautious in your work. Just put your ideas out there more readily. Don't spend so much time reading, spend more time writing. From the beginning, I would listen more to my supervisor than I did at the time in that respect.
And Emilia is smiling because it's not just advice to graduate students everywhere, but it's advice to all of us.
It resonates too well.
Yeah, I felt it quite acutely throughout, even after I'd finished my doctorate. It's a difficult thing to shed. I felt that I had to read everything before I even started formulating my own ideas, and that's a mistake. Of course, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, and you need to be aware of the debates around the topics that you're thinking and writing about. But I think now I would be much more, even perhaps as a student more than as an established academic. It's more important as a student to just take risks, even if you end up making a bad argument, building a bad argument. That will have value. You will learn a lot from it. You will engage with others and learn from them. Do that more from the very beginning. Don't be so worried about what others think about you and your work. Don't be so afraid to disappoint others. That's what I would say to my graduate student self if I could. And also I would say spend more time, or make the most of the time that you have with John. We had wonderful supervisory meetings which lasted for hours, but I still think it wasn't enough. And had I known that he would leave us too soon, I would spend much more time. Would have spent much more time talking philosophy with him.
That's beautiful. And I have to say that one culture shock that I've personally experienced studying at a US university, at a US institution, was that all of the preconceptions around, we need to respect the tradition, and need to respect, you need to fit into the debate, and don't be arrogant.
Yes.
It just seems like JD students off the bat are just completely told, ignore all this. All that matters it matters what you think. And I wonder if we can transplant some of those ideas into home ground of, Europe more broadly, but also the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Yes, I mean, this is something that I was told many times as a student, maybe for cultural reasons. I came from Portugal, which is still a very deferential culture, great respect for authority, and you're very cautious to disagree. When you disagree, you cloak it in the most respectful terms possible. And of course, respectfulness is always important. But having been formed in that culture, I found it very difficult to directly challenge other people's arguments or ideas. And I was always, very often told, you're too deferential. Don't be so deferential. Be more decisive. Be more assertive in your writing, in the way you engage. And I say that to my students, today. I just tell them, of course, be respectful. Of course, be kind, and don't be aggressive in the way you express yourself. If you can avoid, being unnecessarily caustic, do avoid it. But really, don't be afraid of expressing disagreement. Disagreeing with someone, having read their work with attention and engagement is the best compliment you can give someone. So, go ahead and do that. That there's so much to gain.
It's amazing, and this should be our soundbite, I think, Emilia. Honestly, it's just such valuable advice.
I think it really helps. One thing I've realized that it really helps to have a small group of colleagues, friends with whom you discuss your work at different stages of its evolution. I only had that very late only after I finished my doctorate, actually. And that's really precious, to have a group of people you trust, who will share their work with you and with whom you share your work, who will give you feedback, who will read it really with, sharp eyes. That's really important, as early as possible in the process. And then going and, moving on into the future as an academic, you always need that, I think. Community.
Brilliant. Emilia, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to sound a skeptical note, if I may again, because we've discussed this value of expressing your own ideas, especially outside of the inhibiting context of authority, academic authority. I feel that even though it's productive to encourage students to express their ideas, sometimes they have a tendency, all of us have the tendency to express opinions that are not necessarily reasoned opinions. So this is the delicate balance we need to find here, that people actually express reasoned opinions, even if they are their own opinions, as opposed to simply throwing their views that are unsupported with reasons. And that's the danger, or perhaps that's the reason rather why there is such a high pressure in the continental tradition, so to say, on stressing the importance of finding or identifying the authorities. Where does this idea actually come from? Or why do you hold the view you do, as opposed to simply expressing a mere opinion?
Absolutely. And I think that's an important role for supervisors and teachers to play, sort of helping students distinguish, pub sort arguments, pub discussion arguments from philosophical arguments. The invitation to express your views, it is really an invitation to think deeply for yourself and to articulate your views in a way that offers the people who are listening to you a full view of the reasons that support your conclusions. That's the job of your supervisor. Partly the job of your supervisor, your academic advisor, or the person who teaches you at university, is to help you learn to do that. It's a process, and it's a trial and error process. But some of us are more cautious than others, and I would have, if I could go back, perhaps I might try to be more adventurous.
Amazing.
I was.
And it's also funny that you brought up the pub discussions, because I believe that's Emilia's favorite phrase when we're speaking about our own ideas. It's like, oh, this sounds very much like a pub discussion. But if you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be?
That's such a difficult question. So I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think that I would choose the poetry of the 17th century Japanese Zen poet, Basho. So he wrote haiku, so he mastered the haiku form, and I love haiku. I think they're not just poems, they are so much more than poems. They're evocative, they're profound, they're beautiful, they open up imaginative paths beyond the limits of the boundaries of language. They're really sketches. They have a visual impact that other forms of writing don't have. In the case of Basho, his haiku were also the sketches. That's the term that's used in the English translation. Sketches drawn by a traveler, a thoughtful traveler who reflects about things he sees along the way. So it's a very visual experience, but also a very philosophical experience. So I think I would choose either, On Love and Barley, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, or even better, the complete haiku collection by Basho. That would be wonderful.
Amazing. And now we're going to go and read haiku immediately after after the recording. If you had not been an academic, what alternative career would you have chosen?
Oh, okay. So I think there are two answers to that question. One is the answer I would have given you when I was much younger, when I was little, I suppose. There was something that I wanted to be before I decided that I wanted to study law, and that was to be a vet. That was abandoned when I was a teenager. The other answer is the answer I give now, knowing what I know. And if I could live another life, I think I would be an architect. I think. I'm not sure I do very well with all the maths, but I'd like that. I'd like to study architecture and practice architecture.
Perhaps it's not so far removed from what you're doing at the moment. You're just designing institutions or participating institutional design as opposed to building design. But I think a lot of our speakers are very much imaginative individuals who are drawn to some sort of expression and performance outside of pure theoretical and analytic context. So it's fantastic to see that your ambition actually is very, very complex here.
I'm not sure how realistic it is, but yes, it's
again, you could always leave maths to the engineers. So
alternative dream. That's right, exactly. And
a final question. Finish this sentence. One thing no one talks about in academia is.
Well, so I think people are talking about it a bit. So it's not as radical as that, but I think it should be more talked about. And that is the deeply seated inequalities that condition access to the profession. I don't think it's talked about enough. I think people are aware of it, of course, and they sometimes discuss it, but it's not discussed enough. And I could talk about that at length, but I think there are obstacles to access to the academic profession, which are increasing as time goes by, and that we should pay more attention to. And I'm not just talking about sort of gender issues, which are always relevant and impactful in different ways. I'm talking about, just generally social issues of access to education, access to culture, access to knowledge, to just the idea that you could spend your life studying and writing about abstract ideas. I think even just making space for that in life can be a challenge for many people, for most people perhaps. And I think that's a shame. And I think that's also connected to, to a kind of crisis that we're facing, it seems to me, when it comes to recognizing the unique or the distinctive value of a university education. I think it's intellectual development, the exploration of ideas, as we've talked about, the sharpening of intellectual tools that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise in a different context, or at least not in the same way. Space for getting to know yourself, self-knowledge, knowledge of others and of the world. I mean, this involves exposure to varied views and also the freedom to assess them for yourself and to form your own views in a conversation with others, a free conversation with others. And many of whom will hold views very different to your own. I fear that this very precious set of resources is currently under threat.
I think that resonates very much with the opening sentence in your 3 Variations on Law and Truth article, where you speak of David Hume's famous expression that unlike mistakes in religion, which are dangerous, mistakes in philosophy are merely ridiculous, but you dismiss that statement straight away, saying, no, actually, philosophy and theory matters. Ideas do matter. How we explore them could then translate into instances of injustice or prejudice that matters in real life. So I found it very thought-provoking that you rejected the idea that philosophical mistakes are merely ridiculous. They actually do have impact on real life. That's why theoretical work or academic work is very important.
Yes, I think there's no such thing as a merely ridiculous mistake in philosophy.
Maybe on a final thought, just inspired by the very thought-provoking answer you gave us. Which do you, Emilia, did you have an idea of academic career when you were growing up? Was that an option that you would actively understand and consider? I can start. I didn't. So to me, being a lecturer was being a lecturer, and you teach students. But this idea that I got lucky because I got introduced to philosophy by one of my teachers at school. But before then, the idea that you could research this and publish and write and really engage in highly intellectual pursuits just was not part of the vocabulary.
Emilia, do you want to?
Well, it crossed my mind that I could do something literature oriented when I was very little. In fact, I was much more productive as 5 years old than I am now in terms of how spontaneous and prolific I was in putting my ideas on paper. So there was this idea, yes, I can. This can be my profession. I could be a poet, but it didn't cross my mind that I could be an academic, actually. So it's only very late development.
I can say the same thing, actually. It was never something that I aspired to do. I just knew that I wanted to study some things, and later I discovered that I enjoyed teaching. So it all sort of happened kind of naturally, or without much decision making. I mean, of course, there was decision making involved, but it was never a kind of dream to be an academic. Or I knew it was a possibility, but it wasn't something that I aspired to do. It just became a reality as time went by.
Brilliant. And on that note, I think you can wrap up. Raquel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to re-listening to the episode when we are editing it. Emilia, any final words?
Just thank you so much. Now we know that trust matters, but not always. That's a valuable lesson to learn. And thank you for all the thought-provoking questions that you asked in your work. It definitely has been a great pleasure to read and engage with and reflect on. Thank you.
And we look forward to having the study being published.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hi, it's Aleksandra here. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.